This talk is on patterns for your team and architecture. Ways that teams affect architecture, ways that architecture affects teams, and we'll get into an interactive portion as well. So of course it was not a moose that you saw a moment ago, it was camel. And there's a seminal paper written 1968 by Melvin Conway, How Do Committees Invent? So I know you've all been sitting around wondering, how do committees invent? And the joke, of course, is that a camel is a horse designed by committee. What do you think? Look like a horse designed by committee?
Funny, yes.
I think that's unfair. They're cute.
Some committees are better than others. Some produce cuter camels, some pretty ugly, as we'll see. Okay, so really great paper. It's still a great read, however many decades later. People often know this as Conway's law of systems that mirror how they were designed. So you have some design group, some committee designing a system. They break it down, and it turns out that the system they produce, software, in most cases we're talking about, mirrors the organization of the group that produced it. So I'll show you a couple examples here and then talk about some different ways that teams are organized, companies are organized, and how that might affect their software. And that's where we'll get into the workshop portion, kind of looking at experiences that all of you have had that are good examples of these. One of the examples in Mel Conway's paper, really nice and clear, was about Department of Defense weapon system being developed, can be used by two different services within the military. So how did it turn out? Well, of course, the system that they designed ended up mirroring their organization. So it had a common portion, just like on their org chart, and then it had all the weapon characteristics needed by Service A and all the weapon characteristics needed by Service B. So really nice and clear. And you'll see this a lot where you've got like two main positions in some sort of group that's trying to design a system. And what do you know? You end up with two major ways that the software is going to function. Another classic example, maybe you have a team of 4 programmers, each one working independently on a feature for a compiler. You're almost certainly going to get a 4-pass compiler, as each programmer sits down and says, okay, great, I'm going to pass through and I'm going to do all the things I need to do for my feature. And then each one does this independently, so the software ends up working those 4 independent phases. Okay, so we work with a lot of patterns in teams and organizations. I'm sure most of you are familiar with many of these. One common way to divide up software is you might say, okay, this is going to have a front end. It's got the client, talking WebSockets, of course, in Alex's diagram, to the back end. So we'll have a team that works on the front end, team that works on the back end, teams that work on the database. So a pretty common pattern. And this is an interesting one because this partly comes from the architecture, saying, oh, this is common architecture, so let's design our team in that same way. Okay, so thoughts on this particular pattern. We think about teams you've worked on or teams you've seen that have been split in this way. Any advantages or disadvantages that come to mind?
Oh, yeah. Isolation expertise, or only need expertise in the group you're in. I don't need to know about the back end and the database. I just do front end. Sorry with all the verbiage.
No, that's great.
Being able to switch out the back end later if you need it for scalability.
Great. It's a disadvantage, right? Disadvantage.
Oh, I was thinking it was an advantage. Just
that's true. Great. Can be both. Okay. So maybe just a property.
also possibly different teams blocking each other, that they don't know each other well enough to easily communicate and unblock each other.
Great.
I think there's a tendency to put importance based on the population of the group. So for example, if there's 3 back-end developers and 1 front-end, your whole thing is back-end heavy.
That's a great one. Nice. That's one that probably applies to a lot of these patterns. We should call that out and think about. So as we get through some of these patterns, we'll try and tackle some of the ways people react to them. So let's come back to that because that's a great one. Okay, so pretty clear that the organization of these teams has a strong effect on how the project's going to progress. And all of this has kind of come from this Cottom architecture pattern, which is going to affect how the whole project's going to go. Okay, so another common pattern is to say, okay, we've got application development, and then we've got system administration. So build the thing, and then we'll throw it over the fence to the group that's going to maintain it. So nice clear division in a lot of cases, and until recently it was really popular.
Yeah, DevOps solved that, right?
So yeah,
mind.
I think that's exactly one of the things we want to get into. So so save that thought. We'll ignore the existence of DevOps for the moment, and we'll come back to it. So
Yeah, the third group
DevOps.
in your list handles security.
Right, that's a good another good division. Right, you might have security split from system administration.
No, I mean, you didn't list anybody handling security. You forgot the security.
That's another pattern. You just forget security.
So Gabe, it seemed like the bullets we listed in the last one, in the last notes, seem to apply here, right? Or are you getting at something different?
Nope, I think that's good insight. We have basically the same problems by dividing our teams, even though it's along a different axis. Does it solve any of those problems? Do we get unblocked less?
Well, actually, I do know. I run into this daily or weekly. So the application development is dependent on system administration pretty much. When my laptop goes down or has a problem, I have to call somebody, not vice versa. If the if the review server or the staging server instance is down, I can't do my deployment, not vice versa, right? So there's a lot of one-way dependency there.
That's interesting. Right, I bet on the system administration side, people on that team probably feel pretty dependent on application development too. Like, can't they fix this bug so that I can stop having to manually fix it? So that's interesting.
Oh, okay, I guess that was so. That's more like system support or application support team. Okay, you're lumping that in with system administration.
I guess I'm thinking maybe production operations maybe is a better name.
Gotcha.
We'll just fix this in real time. Okay. So we've got both dependencies still. I mean, within application development, we're probably a little less blocked between teams if that's a single homogeneous team. But then
I don't know if we mentioned. Sorry, I cut you off.
but we've got bigger blockers, perhaps at the outside boundary of that team. Go ahead.
I was going to say something we probably didn't mention on the last workshop is then there's a communication channel that needs to happen both at the technical level and at the team level, right? So, we use all these tools, Jira, Slack, to facilitate the communication, but yeah, there's a lot of chances for breakdown.
Great. That's another good cross-cutting thing to capture. However it's organized, what is the actual communication channels that are tying things together?
Ooh, also like the experience or seniority of the engineers per team. Like if the front end team
Yes.
all has junior engineers, they're not going to be able to have the technical leadership to sometimes to make the right decisions for the front end, and they might be have struggle to design with the back end.
That's great. So we've got the population on each team, like the relative populations are going to influence things in the relative seniority of teams. Those are great factors to keep in mind.
And then this one, incentives are like at odds. It's like the whole DevOps culture movement is like application wants to build stuff and operations doesn't want to break stuff.
That's a great one, built-in conflict. So maybe we have a bit more built-in conflict with this setup than we did with the previous one.
Yeah, I still have like the interface challenges of like making sure that when if you're building, you build your back end good, and then your front end is you break them. Whereas like you're really good at communicating in your group, but not so much across the boundaries.
Right.
Gabe, I worked in a group where the application developers were separate from the security testers, and a very interesting feedback loop happened once where the security testers came back with like 3 findings and showed them to the developers, and the developers started arguing with the security testers and said, well, that one's not really a bug, and this other one, reasons and reasons. So the next week, the security testers came back with 7 findings, and the developers argued with them again. And the next time, the security team came back with 12 findings. And the longer the developers argued with the security testers, instead of just fixing the problems, the more findings the security testers came up with.
It's an interesting feedback loop. Cool, that's another great example. Okay, I'm gonna skip over a couple of these a little faster so we can jump into some of the adaptations like DevOps. But I mean, just the hierarchy of companies also affects the structure quite a bit. What departments a company is split into, natural divisions that are going to affect the systems that we build and how we can or cannot evolve those systems. So, right, security testing, part of the security department, and thus gets pushed farther away from application development. That's going to make that communication longer.
Now that's a pretty camel.
It is
Right,
a pretty
Alex?
camel. Yeah. Not a moose. No mistaking that one for this. Okay, so people have been trying to adapt organizations since the beginning of time. Ever since Mel Conway's paper about how communities invent, people have been calling some of these adaptations where you're trying to target the system that you're building, the reverse Conway. Okay, great. We want our application to look this way, so let's go ahead and structure our teams in a similar manner. I mean, you hear that a lot around microservices, but I think it applies to lots of different types of architectures and team organizations. So let's jump into some examples of adaptation. One that's not normally done in a reverse Conway mindset is just reorganization of companies. Often, in response to market forces or other things, companies are being reorganized, particularly product lines being spun up or down. So that provides a really interesting natural experiment to see, okay, great, that reorganization of the teams came from some vector, and what effect did that have over the next few years on the software that was produced? Did it split it up? Did it cause different divisions? So something to keep an eye out for. Okay, so if you've seen a reorganization like that, any examples that come to mind about how that might have affected the software or how the software was developed?
Well, now you don't have a correlation between the organization and the software. Well, there's that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. That what was a clear structure may now really be mixed up. Right?
Gabe, this also came up in another project that I studied. Every time you reorg, all those communication channels that you talked about before, they get broken and they need to be reestablished. It's usually the project managers who set up those communication channels. And every time you change project managers or reorg, it breaks all the communication channels and no communication occurs for a while until they're reestablished, including the informal communication channels that bypass the PM and just go from developer to developer. Those are sometimes very important communication channels.
That's a great insight, right? That it doesn't have to be a formal reorganization. It could just be someone who's a central communicator at one of these interfaces leaving, and then suddenly you have some of the same effects.
I guess a corollary to what I was saying at first, the first point there is that now you have a redistribution or reassignment of responsibilities, right? So it's like, well, we did have a database team. Now that's split between database and network. So now some people go to the database, some people go to the network. People do both. Reassignment of responsibilities.
Hopefully it's not a, now you're in charge of everything assignment.
Well, I did think about that. If you have the monolith architecture, everybody does everything.
Or extreme downsizing. Great. Okay, so a lot of natural experiments in the world there, but some we do a little more deliberately. So one that's been done for a long time, was kind of deliberately thinking about this, was open office plans. In some cases, was deliberate. Like, great, okay, we've got these divisions between these different teams, these interfaces and communication problems. So we'll just throw everyone together and everything will be communicating and it'll all be great. I mean, at least they're cute camels, right? Okay, so with that, we're going to push things together, either in big groups or at least like pushing some teams together. What advantages or disadvantages have we seen of that?
Well, I know that I think the open office plan is kind of like where you have the half height walls, right? So I can just stand up and yell at somebody across the floor, right, and say, "Hey, did you get that done?" "Yeah, I got it done." "Okay." It's like clear or direct verbal communication lines.
I think you can also have maybe over information. I'm stuck hearing about things that don't apply to me, and I kind of fade out and might miss some really important stuff because it's not concise anymore.
Impossible to concentrate. So you put on like noise canceling headphones and you're basically like back to where you started.
Right. People try and impose their own organization on the given organization.
But yeah, I wonder how that would affect the application.
That's why I like Slack, because it encourages the development of these informal communication channels, application developer to application developer.
So that's a good question. So we're assuming that if we move to an open office plan, that we're going to have fewer blockages between teams, but also less clear boundaries. They probably aren't following our API quite as well because it's a little bit easier to have some knowledge of the other layer. Does that match with people's experience? Anyone say like, oh yeah, we switched to an open office plan and I could see everything get a little bit more interrelated, in good ways, but also in in ways that where we had less separation.
Yeah, I could see that too. As this kind of like overarches some of the things we just said, but there would be a level of disorganization, because it's like now you have all these connections. Everything's connected to everything, so there's a disorganization in that way. Things aren't streamlined and clearly separation of responsibilities and connections. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, anyone have any counterexamples? Anyone seen, worked in open office and had things stay pretty clear?
I guess when I worked in open office, they like made the back end group sit by the back end group, and the front end people sat together, at least along like the application lines. So it was kind of like, it was open, but you were still like clustered.
Interesting.
It wasn't just like a random, and like the tech support people were in one area and the app developers were in one area at sales.
Right.
So I don't, maybe it's a bad implementation, but
No, I think that's interesting. Great. We adopted open office to get some mixing, reduce boundaries, but there's a sense that that along those lines of over information, that the other group's information is going to be more distracting. You still want to cluster and maybe make the boundaries a little fuzzier, but not fully dissolve them.
I think there also might be more of a sense of community and collaboration. So I don't feel that I'm isolated from other departments. I can see like, oh, they're doing stuff over there too. Hey, I can interact with them. It's more of like a company camaraderie.
Interesting. So maybe
sense.
that reduces some of the built-in conflict that we're talking about with the previous pattern.
Sure.
I want to see the results of a controlled experiment where we have all the companies use open offices for a few years until everything comes to a steady state homeostasis, and then let's imagine that we break up all the developers and we put them all in separate rooms, separated by miles and miles and miles, and prevent them from meeting in person, face to face, or being able to yell over a cubicle for a number of months. And then it'll probably take a year or two to get the results, but I want to see the results of an experiment like that done sometime.
But aren't we doing that today?
I work from home. In charge of this experiment, Joe. I know it now. You're like, how am I going to engineer this?
Gabe, you're the experimenter has picked you up by the scruff of your neck and dropped you in a maze. You have to find the cheese.
That's right. Except I can't move. It's this little maze right here. Yes.
Sorry, I was talking over you guys, but I work from home now, as do a lot of people. I feel like that experiment's taking place in real time by necessity.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it'd be super interesting if anyone is reflecting on their architecture over the last few months and is able to see a difference. Please email me. I'd be very interested in your example. And we'll see you in the future talk.
Yeah.
Okay. We should wrap up here in just a minute. So I'm going to scoot through. We talked about DevOps just a little bit, as a adaptation to one of those divisions that used to be really common. Clearly trying to change those boundaries to affect the code. I think it's in general, been a pretty good one. Any disadvantages of DevOps anyone like to call out?
it's just operations with another name. Everywhere I've seen it. I've read about Etsy, but I haven't lived it yet.
Yeah, it's a new paradigm. So it's I guess they say it's a state of mind, really, the DevOps concept, and so adaptation, or when you you accept it and do it. I can't think of the word, but adopting the DevOps and actually doing it is probably a roadblock.
Yeah, it's like a cultural adjustment, not just like a rebranding of current process.
Right.
Yeah, it only seems possible if your organization can devote a lot of energy to really good tooling, which is like a hard long-term thing to pitch, it seems like.
Great. Okay, so we better wrap up here. Flattening hierarchy is another adaptation people do sometimes, and sometimes it's hard to just change things. You think it's a camel, but it's really a big rock. It's hard to move. But hopefully we'll have some luck in structuring our organizations to meet the way we'd like our code to be.